Well, good evening everyone, and you're very welcome here to St. Mary's again for this, the second of our Lenten reflections, which this evening I want to just reflect upon the ministry of our Holy Father Pope Francis, because this coming Saturday, the 13th of March, is the 8th anniversary of his election as Pope. He's already been Pope longer than Benedict XVI was Pope. And it's hard to think that because we think, oh, it wasn't that long ago. But of course, it was 8 years ago now. And like a lot of things in the modern world, images are what stay with us. And that's what I want to do this evening, is just look at some of the images which we have of Pope Francis and the way in which they speak to us, but more importantly, the way in which they speak to those beyond the church. Because he very much has this missionary outreach, which is about fraternity. And if you remember last week, in his reflections on the world after the pandemic, in his encyclical, which was published last October, he talked about how equality and freedom grow out of fraternity. The best way to help them to grow is not by campaigning, but is by building fraternity, brotherhood, sisterhood. Though I'm going to keep using the word fraternity because those two words in English, brotherhood and sisterhood, have taken on a whole different sort of meaning. But that's what I want to reflect on this evening. So now, if you go to the National Gallery in Edinburgh and go to see the Seven Sacraments, which are owned by the Duke of Sutherland on permanent loan there in the National Gallery in Edinburgh, and there are these pictures by Nicholas Poussin called the Seven Sacraments. And this is the one called the Sacrament of Ordination. And in it, it is the point where Jesus has asked Peter, "Who do people say I am?" And Peter replies, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus replied, "You are a happy man, Simon Peter, for it was not flesh and blood that revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And so I say to you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." And you might not be able to see it too clearly, but Jesus is holding two keys in his hand. "I give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth shall be considered bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth shall be considered loosed in heaven." And that's the foundation, of course, of the church's understanding of the role of Peter in the life of the church today, the successor of Peter, our Holy Father, present Holy Father, Pope Francis. And I'm sorry if it's the contrast again in terms of the light and the darkness, and I move out of the way occasionally. And that, of course, is the interior of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, which is the largest church in the world. And inside that dome, it has those words of Jesus in Latin, Tu es Petrus, and it goes all the way around the inside of that dome, that passage, giving Peter the keys of the kingdom of heaven and the keys of the kingdom of earth. And that's why all over Rome, you see those cross keys. One gold for heaven, one silver for earth. They're on the papal coat of arms. They're on everything in the city of Rome from the time when the popes were the ecclesiastical, not only the ecclesiastical rulers, but the civil rulers of the papal states, and built the fountains and the bridges and the buildings. And that's why you see the cross keys everywhere. And when the St. Peter's as we know it was built, began in the 16th century, completed in the 17th century, when they decided that we need a square out the front, the Pope asked Bernini to design what's known as the Colonnade, which is this. We stand here if we're looking up at the Pope. This is the design. That's where we stand, in the middle of the square. That's the square with the big obelisk. And there's the steps. And the balcony that the Pope appears on is just there. Why did Bernini decide it like that? To make it look like a key. Because it symbolises once again the power of the keys. You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. I give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And that's why it's designed in that shape. Just in case you've ever wondered. Now, of course, the 11th of February 2013 was quite a day in the history of the life of the church. I remember that day I said Mass in Our Lady of Lourdes in Bishopton, where I was the parish priest. Came in, was having a cup of tea, put on the news, Sky News, just watching it. And along the bottom of the news it said, Pope Benedict resigns. It's a bit absurd, so I got out my phone and started checking and seeing, what's this about? And that morning, in the midst of a general congregation for the Congregation of Saints, the Pope at the end announced his intention to retire at the end of the month of February. Freely, to give up. And that was the first time since, I need to look at the year, 1294, Pope Celestine V was the last pope to retire. And what nobody had noticed was that in the years preceding, Pope Benedict had actually visited the tomb of Celestine V on 2 occasions. It's in a different part of Italy. And on the second occasion, he took off his pallium, which is one of the vestments that the Pope wears, as do archbishops, and he laid it on Celestine's tomb. And at the time, nobody understood what that meant or interpreted it in any way except one pope praying at the tomb of another. Nobody thought to themselves, oh, he's thinking about retiring. But of course, when we look back now, we see that was what he was thinking about at that point. And he did the most astounding thing. One of the largest developments in the life of the papacy in the modern age, where a pope said, I am retiring freely. And of course, Pope Benedict, Emeritus, is still with us. There is only one pope, as he said in an interview 2 weeks ago. Pope Francis is the pope, and Pope Benedict has been very careful to make sure that no one thinks that there are 2 popes, that there are 2 magisteria. There is only one pope, and he never misses an opportunity to remind people that our Holy Father Pope Francis is the Pope. And so, on the night of the 13th of March of 2013, that's what we saw. And of course, the great thing about this medieval way of communicating the election of a pope in the Sistine Chapel, which that chimney comes out of, is that it's so dramatic. It's a lovely picture, it's picturesque. And news and television love that because it's an image and it's so dramatic. And the whole drama of a papal election, which was played out in 2005 when Pope Benedict was elected after the death of Pope St. John Paul, and the whole drama of the election that took place in 2013 was followed avidly by all the news channels because it is dramatic. With the cardinals processing into the Sistine Chapel and the doors being closed, the world excluded, and the only way we know what's happening is twice a day when smoke is burned, either black or white. And then the appearance on the balcony, preceded by one of the cardinals coming out and making the announcement in Latin as to who has been elected. And the secret is to have a list of all the cardinals' first names, because that's what you hear first. And so everybody was scrambling around thinking, George, Mary, who's that? Because he was not one of those that was listed as newspapers and authors and people that appear in these TV programs during the papal election like to say, oh, this cardinal or that cardinal and that. But the names George, Mary didn't appear. And then they got to the surname, Bergoglio. Of course, everyone went, who? Except for those who knew him, which is everyone in South America, which was the College of Cardinals that chose him. And then he appeared. And he appeared in the balcony. And there he is, our Holy Father, Pope Francis. And he did 3 things, there's 3 things about him. He's the first Jesuit to ever be elected Pope. The first non-European in over 1,000 years. Because, of course, there were popes from North Africa in the first 400 or 500 years of the life of the Church. Algeria and Egypt and all those places that were Christian before the expansion of Islam in the 6th, 7th century. There were non-European popes. Of course, they didn't think in those terms. But he was the first from the global south. And then he was the first to take the name Francis. And he said the day afterwards in an interview that the reason that he chose the name Francis was because of the man who's standing there behind him, Cardinal Humis, who is a Brazilian Archbishop Cardinal, who was sitting beside him in the conclave. And when he was elected, Cardinal Humis said to him, "Don't forget the poor." And so, when he was asked, "Do you accept election and what name will you be known by?" he said, "Francis." Because, of course, St. Francis was the first in the life of the Church to follow that life of strict poverty, a new departure in the life of the Church in the 11th century, which then, the 14th century, 13th century, I'm getting it all wrong today, that he chose that name emblematic of who he was going to be as our Holy Father. Now, one of the themes that runs through his papacy is that of the humility of Francis, and he showed that right away on that balcony that night, because he said this: "My dear brothers and sisters, good evening. You know it was the duty of the conclave to give Rome a bishop, and it seems that my brother cardinals have gone to the ends of the earth to get one. But here we are. I thank you for your welcome. The diocesan community of Rome now has its bishop. Thank you. And first of all, I would like to offer a prayer for our Bishop Emeritus, Benedict XVI. Let us pray together for him, that the Lord may bless him and that Our Lady may keep him." Those prayers have been very effective. And then he went on and he said, "And now I would like to give the blessing, but first I ask a favour of you. Before the bishop blesses his people, I ask you to pray to the Lord that he will bless me." The prayer of the people asking the blessing for their bishop. Let us make in silence this prayer. You pray over me. Now I will give the blessing to you and to the whole world, to all men and women of goodwill. That's what he's doing in that picture there. He's bending forward, asking that the people who are in that square and the people who are watching on television, you and me, he's bent over, asking for blessing. The servant of the servants of God, which was one of the favourite titles of the papacy of John Paul II. Because he said that when he went around the world and saw these massive crowds and he was going round the crowd with the Popemobile, he knew that what the people were cheering was Peter, not John Paul. It was the successor of Peter that the people wanted to see. And so, more often than not, John Paul had his little rosary ring in his hand, and while he was waving and while he was acknowledging the crowds going round through them in the Popemobile, he was saying his rosary. Francis expresses that same humility by asking the people's prayers. And it's something that he'll do time and time again. Almost everyone he meets, he says to them, "Pray for me." He said it to the Queen when the Queen was with him, and she said to him, "Pray for my family." So he set out at the very beginning with that act of humility. But it was also an act of fraternity. That is, that we are praying for each other. I'm going to bless you as the Bishop of Rome, but I want you to ask in prayer that God will bless me in this ministry as your bishop to the people of the city of Rome. Because the Pope always gives the blessing, urbi et orbi, to the city and to the world. Because first and foremost, he is the Bishop of Rome. That's why he is the universal pastor of the Church, because he is the successor of Peter as the Bishop of Rome. Now, of course, all sorts of things happened. in those first few months. Who is he? Where did he come from? How was he involved at the time of the dictatorship in Argentina? What did people think of him there? What was he like then? What is he like now? All the things about his humility and his poverty, the way in which he travelled by bus, he didn't live in the Archbishop's palace but in a simple house. All of that all became a part of what we knew about Pope Francis. But one of the first things that he did was because of something that happened, which was a terrible tragedy. 2013 was one of those years in which, as he described it himself, the Mediterranean was in danger of becoming a graveyard. Now, I'll move out of the way so you can see this picture properly. But it's a picture of a beach in an island called Lampedusa, which is the first island you come to which is Italian when you're travelling from North Africa by boat. And as you can see, there are bodies wrapped, people who have drowned. There's a little boat here in the background, and there is these rescuers, all the fire service and ambulance and paramedics. And that day, 130 people drowned who were crowded onto a small boat. Another 130 or 140 people were saved. And Francis was horrified. And he attacked, not by name, but he made clear that he was not happy at the way in which the Italian government, the European Union, governments in Western Europe were not responding properly to this refugee crisis. And so he went to Lampedusa and he said Mass. He met the refugees who had survived, because the island was the first stopping point for many who are fleeing from North Africa. And the altar, which was built for his Mass, was a very simple one. And it was made to look like that little boat that was on the shore. An image that stays with us once again, of Francis expressing the idea of the fraternity that we all share and that each of us needs to respond to in terms of those in most need. What he talked about, those on the margins, those on the periphery, not simply of the church, but of the world. And refugees in our age are amongst the most vulnerable. And so he has continued to speak out on that issue because he wants to protect their dignity. And that dignity is what underlies the respect which is due to every person, made in the image and likeness of God. Brothers and sisters, all. Fratelli Tutti is the title of that encyclical I mentioned from October 2020, which is a phrase taken from St. Francis. Brothers all. Brothers and sisters all, as we would translate it these days. So, fraternity is what brings freedom. It's what brings prosperity. Fraternity is what brings liberty. It's what builds freedom and liberty and equality. Because we recognize the dignity of one another. And we mentioned this last week. We recognize the dignity of one another. And we have to guard that dignity wherever we find it in another person. And for him, the refugees typified that. And at that stage, were the most important example of how fraternity needed to be built. In the welcome given to refugees, in the relief given to them, in the safety that they needed. Now, fraternity, of course, reaches across all races, all religions, all the world. It needs to be built everywhere. And Pope Francis travelled to the Holy Land. And when he went there, he took with him two friends from Argentina. One was a rabbi and one was an imam. And when they went to Jerusalem and visited the Temple Mount, he had those two men with him. The Temple Mount in Jerusalem, of course, is where the temple was, in the Western Wall, the Wailing Wall, the wall that people still to this day pray at. But it's also, of course, a sacred spot in Islam, because on that mount is the Dome of the Rock, which is the mosque, which is where the Prophet Muhammad supposedly ascended to heaven, and is the third most holiest site in Islam. And at that spot, as you can see here, the Pope is hugging his two friends from Buenos Aires, a rabbi and an imam. Brothers all, fraternity. And it's the effect that images like that have, not for us necessarily, or not only for us, but on the Jewish community and in the Islamic community. The Jewish community were concerned because when Pope Benedict retired, one of the leading Jewish scholars in the world said there had been no greater advocate of the reconciliation between the Jewish people and the Catholic Church than Pope Benedict as Pope, but more importantly, prior to that, as Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger. And of course, John Paul had begun that reconciliation in his papacy. And so they were a bit unsure of a new Pope, what will happen. But when they discovered it was the Archbishop of Buenos Aires, who was one of the first of those to appear on the scene of the synagogue in Buenos Aires when it was damaged and when people lost their lives in a terrorist attack, they knew that relations would continue. And that image portrays more than any words what our Holy Father feels about the fraternity that exists between the great religions of the world. Judaism, as Pope St. John Paul described the Jewish people as our elder brothers in the faith, and said once, we are all spiritually Semitic. And Islam, the three great world faiths, believing in the one God, all tracing their ancestry to Abraham, our father in faith, as we say in the Eucharistic prayer. Brothers all, expressed in that image. And the very fact that he took his two friends with him to Jerusalem, invited them from Buenos Aires to accompany him on that trip to Jerusalem. And if you remember, I said that quite often he asked for people's prayers. Well, when he travelled to Istanbul, when he paid a visit to Turkey, though of course the name of Istanbul is a modern name, it was Constantinople, founded by the Emperor Constantine, and the Patriarch of Constantinople was as important in the early church as the Bishop of Rome was. And for the first 1,000 years, the Pope in Rome and the Patriarch in Constantinople led church east and west until the Great Schism in the 11th century. When the Pope went to Constantinople, to Istanbul, and went to St. George's Cathedral, and I'll move over here again because the Pope's white and my black don't quite go together. There he is, inclining his head, asking for the blessing of the Patriarch of Constantinople. The present Patriarch is called Bartholomew. And if you can see, the Patriarch is kissing the Pope's head. Now, quite often, the Patriarch Bartholomew is present in Rome for great events. I was there in the square once where he spoke at the end of Mass at one of the events. I can't remember what exactly the event was. But that relationship has built only in the last 50 years. Because until 1969, the Pope from the 11th century and his successors, and the Patriarch of Constantinople and his successors were excommunicated by each other. And in 1969, Pope St. Paul VI, and the Patriarch Athanargos was his name at that time, lifted those excommunications, which had been there for 900 years. But this image of the Pope asking for the blessing of the Patriarch expresses a great deal about the unity of Christ's Church, East and West. Pope John Paul II used to say that the Church had two lungs, and the East and the West must be brought to breathe together again. Because, of course, we are not in communion with each other. We share apostolic succession, we recognise each other's sacraments, each other's hierarchy, but we are not in communion with each other for a variety of reasons, some theological, but sometimes as well it's about authority. And when the Pope met with the Patriarch, he said, "I am meeting a brother. We are two brothers." Paul VI had talked about that back in the 1960s, talking about Peter meeting Andrew, because of course Andrew is the patron saint of Greece and of the Orthodox Church. And so Paul VI referred to that as well. It is two brothers meeting. Peter meets Andrew once again. And our Holy Father, in this image, speaks to the Orthodox world about the humility of the successor of Peter, not wanting to dominate, not wanting to take control, but to reach out in fraternity, in brotherhood. Peter meeting Andrew. And of course what it also gave was great dignity to the Patriarch, because Christianity in Turkey is not a major faith today. It would be as imagine that St. Peter's in Rome was a little isolated island of Christianity in a country which professed a different religion, which of course is the situation that continues to this day in Turkey. It's a very difficult place for Christians to be. In fact, it's still illegal. I couldn't walk down the street in Turkey dressed like this. It's illegal for priests to dress like priests in public. And so that image also gives dignity to the Patriarch in the context of Turkish society, of that part of the world. So he continued that tradition, but he achieved something that Pope St. John Paul never achieved. A number of things, two principally. The first one was that he met this man. Sorry, that's the Patriarch. Again, that's them on the balcony together. He met this man, and he's Patriarch Cyril, and he's the Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church. And the Russian Orthodox Church has always refused to meet with the Catholic Church. There have been informal, and when Kirill was a simple bishop, he was in fact the envoy of the previous Patriarch to the popes in Rome, meeting with Benedict and with Francis. And then he himself got elected as Patriarch of Moscow, so leader of the Russian Orthodox Church. But the question of where that meeting would take place was always a delicate one, because do I come to you? Do you come to me? Whose house do we meet in? So they did a curious thing. The Pope was going to Brazil for the World Youth Day. And as part of that trip, he stopped off in Cuba, as two of his two predecessors had been to Cuba as well. And the Patriarch of Moscow just happened to be in Cuba at the same time. John Paul had a great desire to visit Russia. It was one of the few countries on the face of the earth that he never got to visit. Francis hasn't been to visit Russia yet, but he's also achieved something that John Paul desired, which was to meet with the Patriarch of Moscow and to begin that reconciliation of that division, of the history of that strife between Catholic and Russian Orthodox, to heal that in fraternity, because we are all brothers and sisters. This image speaks to the Russian world. It speaks to the Orthodox world of Bulgaria, of Romania, in the Ukraine, all the Orthodox churches that look to the Patriarch of Moscow as their leader and not to Constantinople. See that image. Two brothers standing side by side. Another powerful image which doesn't necessarily speak to you and me, unless we understand the significance, but speaks powerfully to those for whom Russian Orthodoxy is an important part of their Christian spiritual heritage, as to who they are, and not to fear the successor of Peter, once again about domination or property or any of the things that have divided us in history, and the way in which, for example, during the Second World War, Stalin used religion to divide us and to conquer the Ukraine in history. But our Holy Father, Pope Francis, has reached out in fraternity to the Orthodox in a way that John Paul would have been envious of, because they didn't get the same response. But he has achieved this. But much remains to be done. Let's not try and kid on here. There is still work to be done. But that image speaks to the Orthodox world. And while he was in Cuba, just like his two predecessors, he met with Fidel Castro. There on the top left you can see Pope St. John Paul. That was 1998. Pope Benedict meeting with Castro, who had by that time stepped down as president of Cuba. And then Pope Francis meeting with Castro, a very frail, elderly man at this stage. And many years before, Fidel Castro had been asked, when will there be diplomatic relations with the United States? And Castro said, there will be a Latin American pope before Cuba and the United States establish diplomatic relations. Diplomatic relations were established that year that Pope Francis was in Cuba. And the papacy, the Foreign Service of the Holy See, were involved in facilitating, the American bishops were involved in facilitating the contacts between the American government, led by President Obama at that time, Vice President Biden, nearly forgot his name there, who's now, of course, President of the United States. And that relationship was established. Brothers all, healing wounds, bringing people together, fraternity. Fraternity builds peace. Fraternity builds freedom. Fraternity builds equality. Fraternity runs through everything that the Pope has done when you reflect upon his missionary journeys. And then, of course, in the last week, we've seen a very dramatic visit, which was to Iraq. And in visiting Iraq, he managed to meet with this man, who is the spiritual leader of the Shiite Muslims. We tend to think that the Ayatollahs in Iran are the most important leaders of Shiite religion, but in fact, it is this man, Ayatollah al-Sistani, who is 90 years of age, someone whom everyone who follows the Shiite path of Islam look to for leadership. He's rarely seen in public, he's 90 years of age, and he rarely meets visitors. And when he does, there's all sorts of protocol that he's seated and they walk in because they are guests and he doesn't need to stand to greet them. But look at that image, the one on the top right. He stood up welcoming the Pope. They are sitting side by side, chatting. And for half an hour, they spoke together in private, on their own, with just interpreters. Content of that, who knows? But the Pope was very keen to meet this man because Sistani is one of those who has tried to end conflict in that part of the world. He is a man of peace, when there are others who don't use the language of peace. But he has. And our Holy Father, Pope Francis, acknowledged that. Yesterday, in his weekly address, weekly audience, he reflected upon the trip to Iraq, and he said, "In the past few days, the Lord allowed me to visit Iraq, carrying out a project of St. John Paul II. Never before has a pope been in the land of Abraham. Providence willed that this should happen now, as a sign of hope after years of war and terrorism during a severe pandemic." And he said that the meeting with Grand Ayatollah al-Sistani was an unforgettable event in his hometown of Najaf. And that trip was historic because, of course, usually when world leaders go to Iraq, it's to visit their troops. Quite often the President of the United States goes there at Thanksgiving or at Christmas to eat with his troops, or a British Prime Minister, or foreign ministers, or defence ministers. They go not in the way in which they would visit any other country, but they go to those that are involved in the conflict. But the Pope went to everyone. He's the first person of any standing to visit Iraq since the Second Gulf War, to make a state visit in effect to that unhappy land, divided by conflict, by war. And he said that the response to war is not another war. The response to weapons is not other weapons. The response is fraternity. This is a challenge, he said yesterday, not only for Iraq, but for many regions in conflict and ultimately for the whole world. Our Holy Father wants to build peace with fraternity. And he travelled to those areas which traditionally have been Christian. The Christian church has existed in Iraq since the 1st century. The city of Mosul and other cities like that have been Christian since way back then, for 2,000 years. And they've suffered greatly since the Gulf War. There were something like 500,000 Christians of various denominations, some in union with the papacy, others in union with Constantinople. Various denominations of about 500,000. At present, they think there's perhaps less than 200,000 remaining because they've been driven out by terrorism, by fear, and many of them were killed, and much destruction. And he visited the city of Mosul. In the town square there were 4 cathedrals for the 4 different denominations, all destroyed. And that image there, you see him sitting on a seat, which behind it has a cross, and that cross is made from the roof beams, just like the beams of our church here, of that destroyed cathedral in Mosul. Now you could take this image as an image of triumph, in that you could say, well, those who threatened the Pope from that spot, and it's true, in that very place, when they destroyed the Christian cathedrals, they said, and one day we shall take Rome and we shall behead the Pope. When the Pope went there last weekend, he didn't go triumphalist and say, here I am, where are you? He didn't say, we won, we're still here. He didn't say any of those things that were confrontational. What he called for was peace, because of fraternity. The fraternity expressed in his visit to Ur, where Abraham was born, and where he travelled to the Holy Land from. The fraternity that's based upon the fact that we all look to Abraham as our father in faith. The fraternity which will build peace, which will build equality, which will build liberty, allowing us to live the lives that God intended us to live and wants us to live. And his final reflection yesterday on his trip was this: in spite of the destruction and weapons, the palm trees, symbol of the country and its hope, have continued to grow and to bear fruit. So it is for fraternity, the Pope said. It does not make noise, but is fruitful and makes us grow. Fraternity does not make noise, but it is fruitful and makes us grow. Thanks be to God for the ministry of our Holy Father, Pope Francis, who in 2 days' time will be 8 years our Pope. We pray for his continued safety and health, and we pray that God will continue to bless the Church and the whole world, because Francis leads us. Thank you. Good night.